our second study on the subject of sexuality in the Black Church, a Womanist Perspective by Kelly Brown Douglas. This is chapter 2, our second study, and it's entitled Stereotypes, False Images, Terrorism, the White Assault upon Black Sexuality. The white assault upon Black sexuality. Carnal, passionate, lustful, lewd, and the word, let me see here. Rapacious, which means aggressive, greedy, or grasping. Rapacious, which means greedy, grasping, aggressively. Rapacious, bestial, sensational. These are just some of the many terms that come to mind when thinking of ways in which white culture has depicted Black people's sexuality as carnal, passionate, lewd, lustful, rapacious, bestial, sensual. These are, again, some of the terms that come to mind when thinking of ways in which white culture has depicted Black people's sexuality. This practice of dehumanizing Black people by maligning their sexuality has been a decisive factor in the exercise of white power in America. It's a form of oppression, and I don't believe the Bible promotes oppression. We don't see that in Scripture. Hebrew people were free from Pharaoh, of their oppressiveness of the Hebrew people, enslaving them. These stereotypes have been critical to the achievement of the unprincipled racist power. It's racist. Might as well call it for what it really is. By disguising and mystifying objective reality, they have been indispensable to the maintenance of the social, political, and economic status quo in America. Since most of these racist characters were developed in order to justify the institution of slavery, this second chapter will focus on the emergence and the efficacy of these stereotypes during the slavery era. While slavery is certainly the cauldron out of which demeaning attacks on Black sexuality were formed, these attacks were grounded in ideologies and attitudes that preceded the slavery era, preceded slavery. They were rooted in Europeans' first encounters with Africans. When Europeans first encountered Africans, before we were brought here, transatlantic journey, During these encounters, which was mentioned in chapter 1, Europeans were often struck by the stark differences in appearance between themselves and Africans. They saw a huge difference. We looked a lot different from them. They were also impressed by the difference in customs, rituals, religion, and the basic way of life. We lived differently. We did things differently, and that's a good thing. We're unique. The differences in appearance, there was a difference in our appearance, our dress, our religion, and manner of living converged to give rise to new notions, as well as, no doubt, to support already existing notions that Africans were an extremely lascivious people. Lascivious people. Lascivious, showing excessive sexual drive. We were lustful, according to Europeans. One especially despicable myth fabricated by European travelers to Africa involved apes. I want you to hear this. One especially despicable myth. I told you this was, I didn't mention earlier that this is a scholarly study. This is heavy. This is heavy, and I love it, and I pray that those who are watching will just love how this theologian is just opening up our eyes to things that we may not have known before, but just the deep and richness of her study and her thoughts and how she's articulated her thoughts in her writings. Let's go back here. It says, one especially despicable myth fabricated by European travelers to Africa involved apes. Englishmen easily drew comparisons between the sexual habits of these animals and those of Africans. They looked at the apes and they drew comparisons with us. Now, in doing so, that literally mean that they didn't see us as being human. We were animalistic. One 16th century writer on the subject advanced that men that have low and flat nostrils, that is, the Africans, are lascivious. What did I say again? That's oversexed. Lascivious. That means to be what? Showing excessive sexual drive because of our nose. Because of our nose, our flat nostrils, that we are lascivious as apes that attempt women. Even more perverse stories develop as Europeans intruders into Africa allege actual sexual contact between apes and African women. They believe that African women and apes had sexual relations. Isn't that something? Isn't that something? That's food for thought, isn't it? Isn't that something? By forging a sexual link between Negroes and apes, Englishmen were able to give vent to their feelings that Negroes were lewd, lascivious, and wanton people because they believed that we intermingled with apes. Myths such as those just noted concerning Africans' sexual deviance were well established in European culture by the time the Europeans invaded America. It was already embedded in their psyche that we were animalistic, believing that we had sexual relations with apes. But again, it would be during the slavery era that these myths would take on the peculiarities of white culture and that specific white cultural stereotypes concerning black men and women would form. Now listen to this. This is going to blow your mind. Everybody should listen to this video and watch this video, because this is really heavy. And you can Google this and look it up for yourself. I hope you're watching and that you'll look this up and do your own research. In 1810, one Sarah Baartman, Bartmann. In 1810, one Sarah Baartman, Bartmann, a black South African woman, also known as Hottentot Venus. She was known as Hottentot Venus, caused a scandal in London when she was exhibited to the public in a manner offensive to decency. In the early 19th century, listen to this, Sarah Baartman was a circus-like attraction across Europe. Her naked body was displayed so that Europeans could gaze upon one particular aspect of her physiognomy. What does the word physiognomy mean? Physiognomy is a person's facial features or expressions, especially when regarded as indicative of character or ethnic origin. So look at her physiognomy. Her protruding buttocks. She had a large backside. And you go Google, and you'll show a depiction of her. You look at her backside and say to yourself, haven't we seen other women with large backsides? And can you only imagine what whites still think when they see a black woman with a large backside? She had a protruding buttocks. After 5 years of this dehumanizing exhibition, Sarah Baartman died in Paris at the age of 25. Her degradation, however, continued long after her death. An autopsy was performed on her with particular attention being paid to her genitalia, her vagina. The treatment of Sarah Baartman points to the manner in which white culture studiously demeaned black sexuality in its efforts to dehumanize black men and women. First of all, it reveals how this culture relied on the authority of science to support its stereotypes by providing evidence that black people were biologically presupposed to being lascivious and sexually perverse. As in the case of Sarah Baartman, studies were conducted upon her genitalia of black people, especially black women, reminiscent of the early European assumptions. These studies generally concluded that black men and women had more in common physically and biologically with apes. They believed that we had a lot in common with apes than with other human beings. That in itself is considered to be oppressive. That and drawing that conclusion, that's why we were oppressed. And some would even go as far as to say that we're still being oppressed. The treatment of Sarah Baartman further suggests the perhaps subtle role of Christian tradition in the attack upon Black sexuality. The depiction of Sarah Baartman is representative of the manner in which Black men and women were to be depicted by white culture. They were portrayed as lustful and passionate beings, that such a nature served as sufficient proof of Black people's inferiority, and thus their need to be dominated by white people. No doubt reflects the influence of the Western Christian tradition, which condemn human sexuality as evil. The prominence of Sarah Baartman suggests the centrality of Black women to the success of white culture. Since women in general are held in such low regard by white patriarchal society, it is a logical conclusion for this culture to blame Black women for Black depravity. They always depict us against each other. That's a tactic that's still being utilized today. Stereotypes and false images surrounding Black female sexuality provide the foundation for sexual exploitation and humiliation of Black men, as well as for fostering notions of white male and female superiority. Some of these stereotypes and images have been so insidious that they continue to influence Black people's responses to sexual issues right today. One of the most prominent stereotypes has characterized the Black female as what? As a person governed almost entirely by her libido. She has been described as having an insatiable sexual appetite. That's what they believe. Being extraordinarily passionate and being sexually aggressive and cunning. Such stereotypes has produced the paramount image of Black womanhood in white culture as the Jezebel image. She's a Jezebel. Jezebel has come to symbolize an evil, scheming, and seductive woman. This symbol no doubt owes its meaning to the 19th century Phoenician princess and wife of the Israelite king Ahab, who was accused of destroying the kingdom with her adulterous practices and otherwise diabolical ways. And we find that in 1 Kings, the 16th chapter, verse 29, through the 22nd chapter, verse 53. Through the Jezebel images in relation to Black women would come to fruition during slavery. Travelers often interpreted African women's sparse dress appropriate to the climate of Africa, as a sign of their lewdness and lack of chastity. It's hot in Africa, so they dressed. They didn't put on a lot of clothing. That didn't mean that they were lewd and had anything to do with their lewdness. White explains this: the idea that Black women were exceptionally sensual first gained credence when Englishmen went to Africa to buy slaves. Unaccustomed to the requirements of tropical climate, Europeans mistook semi-nudity for lewdness. How ignorant. How ignorant. That's very ignorant. For instance, the institution of slavery forced Black women to display their bodies in a manner that was considered contrary to antebellum notions of more chaste and decent women. Clothing signified one's moral status as well as their class. Clothing. So if you didn't have less clothing, that means you were looked down upon. So it says here, clothing signified one's moral status as well as class. A respectable white woman was thus adorned in layers of clothing. But by contrast, the enslaved female was often given barely enough clothing to cover her body. See how intentional that is? The white woman stays fully clothed. That's looked upon as being, her body's covered. But the African woman's body has less clothing on, so she's looked down on. In addition to enslaved women's work in the fields often required her to raise her dress above her knees. Even house servants often had to pull their skirts up to polish and to wash floors. Their sparse covering, coupled with working in a manner that required that they were even more exposed, all fed the sentiment that Black female was a wanton, loose creature. No, she was hot, and she needed to pull her clothes up because she was hot. She needed some air. A lot of clothing, and she was doing all that hard labor down on the floor, out in the field. She needed to pull her clothes up so she can get, be cool. Each slave, whether female or male, is brought up to the block and sometimes stripped entirely of all clothing, that the buyer may examine as to any bodily defect in their persons, their private areas are handled like oxen or horses, and each is sold separately to the highest bidder. Just treated just like animals, just like a horse. That's how we were treated. This is when a girl became a woman, she was required to go to a man and become a mother. Slave girl, child. Master would sometimes go and get a large male, hardy Negro man from some other plantation to go to his Negro woman. He would ask the other master to let this man come over to his place to go to his slave girls. A slave girl was expected to have children as soon as she became a woman. Some of them had children at the age of 12 and 13 years old. Negro men 6 feet tall went to some of these children. Men that were literally 6 feet tall would go to these children. Once enslaved females were considered Jezebels, then all manner of treatment of them was deemed appropriate. They were considered to be Jezebels. Just, they oversexed and just all about. They could be worked brutally in the fields, displayed on public auction blocks like cattle, and exploited as breeders. Adding to the persistence of Jezebel imagery was the fact that this image was necessary to ideas of white male and female privilege and superiority. The Black woman as a Jezebel was a perfect foil to the white middle-class woman who was pure, chaste, and innocent. Wow. By distorting Black woman's sexuality, the Jezebel image protected the white slavocracy and fostered the exercise of tyrannical white power. Yet as significant as the Jezebel image was to slaveocracy and white power in general, it was effective only in so much as it functioned in conjunction with another powerful and tenacious image fostered upon Black women, that of Mammy. Mammy. She was considered to be a mammy. Okay. Mammy symbolized both the perfect female and the perfect slave. She was the happy homemaker, the rear of white children, and the dutiful, obedient slave to her master and her mistress. By distorting the sexuality of Black women, white culture effectively dehumanized them. Such dehumanization made them most vulnerable to rape by white men. The Black women were Jezebels meant that Black men had no choice but to be passionate and lascivious, if for no other reason than to fulfill the sexual desires of the hot Black woman. Wow. Black men were regarded like their female counterparts as highly sexualized, passionate beings. They were considered lewd, lascivious, and also quite sexually proficient. Black male sexual prowess has become almost legend in the stereotypical logic of white culture. The idea that Black men possess an unusual large penis has only reinforced notions of their sexual aggressiveness and mastery because of the size of their penis. Negro penis was larger than the white man's, had become something of a commonplace in European scientific circles. The size of a Black man's penis. So it goes on to say that for it being a Jezebel meant that Black women were seducers, then being a buck meant that Black men were sexual predators. Castration, meaning to cut off their genitals. Castration is the removal of the testicles of a male animal or man. The castration of male calves was initiated, but they're talking about this is castration of male testicles. So castration, thought though objected to by some Englishmen and abolitionists, became punishment meted out to Black men that cut off their testicles. It was initially used as a penalty for running away, plotting, insurrection, or similar offenses in the eyes of the slave-holding class. With continued outcry from abolitionists and others about its practice, by the 18th century, it became a punishment primarily in accusations of rape. Okay. Even as lynching was clearly a sexually directed and motivated attack against Black male bodies, lynchings, it was a primary weapon employed to control Black men and women socially, economically, as well as politically. That is lynching. Lynching is thus a classic example of the tools used to enforce and uphold white patriarchal hegemony, dominance. If the Black woman was most vulnerable to rape, the emancipated male, still thought of as a violent buck, was vulnerable to being lynched. Indeed, almost 3,000 black people were reportedly lynched between 1889 and 1918. Some 50 were women, and thus the overwhelming number were black men, while lynchings were justified by the claim that the man hanged had violated a white woman. It was more often simply rumors of rape that led to such lynchings. Just the rumor that a black man went into a white woman, that he would be lynched. Just the rumor. The real threat to white male supremacy probably rested in the knowledge that some white women were actually attracted to a black men, and voluntarily entered into a relationship with them. I wonder why. I'll leave that for you to think about. I wonder if it had anything to do with his genitals. But again, the perceived threat to white male supremacy went beyond black males' real or imagined sexual contact with white women. Lynching was not simply utilized as a remedy for an imagined sexual crime. It was a response to so-called social, political, and economic challenges that white men felt from black males. Wow. This is something. As long as white culture exists, as long as white culture exists, as long as white culture exists, attacks upon black sexuality will persist. This point is made poignantly clear by the continued presence of the most salient sexual stereotypes. The portrait of black women as mamming lasted long after slavery, largely because the jobs most available to black women have been as domestic workers in white households. Deborah Gray White intuits, surely there is some connection between the idea of mamming, the service, and the domestic jobs readily offered to black women, and their near exclusion from other kinds of work. The idea of the black woman as a powerful matriarch, most commonly referred to in stereotypic language as Sapphire, was cemented in white culture by a 1965 report on the Negro family by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who at the time was Assistant Secretary of Labor and Director of the Office of Policy and Planning and Research in the Johnson administration. The report opens by presenting the deterioration of the Negro family as the fundamental source of the weakness of the Negro community. The Moynihan report therefore perpetuated the perception of black people as deviant, especially as Moynihan attacked the black family by means of black sexuality. Wow. That's huge. By blaming black women for the plight of black men and hence the plight of black family, the report directed attention away from the social, economic, and political structures, all of them racist and patriarchal, that actually deprived black men of work and relegated black women to domestic labor. According to Moynihan, black boys in female-led homes were in particular jeopardy. Lacking strong black male role model, the boys were destined to be sexually confused, to demonstrate various antisocial behaviors and to become welfare dependent. So because of the lack of males, boys became somewhat feminine. So they're laying the groundwork for homosexuality in the Monahan and how black boys were perceived back then. If Mammy in the white homes is a de-sex figure, then Mammy as matriarch in the black home is an oversexed figure. The matriarch represents the sexually aggressive woman, one who emasculates black men because she will not permit them to assume roles as black patriarchs. So believing that the black woman won't let the black man be the patriarch of the family. By skillfully transforming the image of Mammy into that of a matriarch, white culture has continued to demean black women and disparage their sexuality to make it appear that white male hegemony is natural and normal, if not inevitable. The overarching black woman becomes the scapegoat for the so-called emasculation of black men. So again, using the black woman against the black man. Is that new? Does that sound new? It doesn't to me. The myth of the black matriarchy as a social disease was presented by racist forces to redirect our attentions away from the real sources of black oppression. The black welfare mother or queen is portrayed as one who, like Jezebel, is most suited for breeding children. Welfare mothers are characterized as promiscuous, unmarried women who sit around, collect government checks, and give birth to a lot of children. Wow. White culture blames the woman for her impoverished condition and again deflates attention away from white racist patriarchal structures. In essence, the welfare mother represents a woman of low morals and uncontrolled sexuality, factors identified as the cause of her impoverished state. That the welfare mother or queen's image continues to be an effective means for seizing and maintaining power in a racist, patriarchal society is illustrated by the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas' quest for power. While still a congressional aide, Thomas shamelessly attacked the character of his sister, Emma Mae Martin, in front of a 1980s San Francisco conference sponsored by Black Republicans. He depicted Miss Martin as a quintessential welfare queen. Wow, his own sister. Doesn't surprise me. Thomas was unwittingly disclosed more about himself than about his sister. He revealed that he had been so indoctrinated by white culture that he shared the contempt of black women found in that culture. Reflective of white cultural animus, he grossly and crudely distorted the truth and maligned a black woman, his own sister, attacking her character through her sexuality as a means to support his place in white patriarchal hegemony or white dominance. There is no more poignant examples of continuing power of the Jezebel image than Anita Hill's treatment when she brought charges of sexual harassment against the then nominee for the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas. While these hearings were rife with racially and sexually loaded cliques and conventions, some carelessly and some selfishly introduced by Thomas himself, none stood more than those surrounding Anita Hill. Thomas portrayed her as a vengeful woman whose flirtations were spun, and as one who was angry because of his interest in lighter complexion, that is, white, such as his wife, women. In essence, in his defense, witnesses came forward who characterized Hill as a tease who became vindictive in the face of rejection. So Clarence Thomas did exactly what whites have always have done to us, and he turned the tables and he did exactly what they did to us. I guess he must have assumed that he now, because of his position or what he was inspiring to be, become the next Supreme Court justice, and believing that he was going to utilize the same principles and things that whites have used against us. He did the very same thing. What does that make him? What does that make him? After all was said and done, Anita Hill's charge of sexual harassment did not stand a chance of ever being taken seriously. Clarence Thomas had successfully masterminded her undoing by providing the bait necessary for others to see Anita Hill as a typical black Jezebel. He did exactly what they have always done to us. The female became the villain. Thomas, the male, became the victim. In the scenario carefully orchestrated by Thomas Hill, the so-called Jezebel was caught in her own web. This time she was caught seducing a black man instead of a white man. Woo! That could have been a victim of sexual harassment, thus impossible, as a Jezebel, after all, asks for whatever sexual treatment she receives, from harassment to rape. The beliefs persist that black women are always ready for sex and, as a consequence, cannot be raped. Introducing the specter of sex, Hill made herself vulnerable to the Virginia Thomas Clance's white wife retort. Hill as both the oversexed black Jezebel, anxious for sex, and as the rejected, vindictive woman who trumps up a charge of sexual harassment, really wanted to sleep with Clarence Thomas. I beg to differ. The Thomas hearings poignantly illustrated the powerful legacy of sexual stereotypes crafted during slavery in relation to black women. White culture effectively maintained the image of the black male as violent, raping buck long after chattel slavery. The tragedies of black history are a testament to this fact. As mentioned earlier, rumors of rape have consistently led to black men being lynched and castrated far into the 20th century. That is just something to just ponder and to hear and to read. From Clarence Thomas hearings to the Simpsons saga, it is obvious that the myths and stereotypes surrounding black people's sexuality are still prevalent. Mammy, Jezebel, and the violent buck remain essential to white culture's defense of white hegemony. And again, what is hegemony? Hegemony is leadership or dominance, especially by one country or social group over others. So we want to end right here. And I want to thank you for watching this video. Please join us on next Thursday. Please subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so. Please share with your friends and others. Let them know that we have a scholarly study of Scripture, and we will get into Scripture. We will bounce between the book and the Scripture to support what's being said by the author. But I want to thank you for viewing this video. Please like, please dislike, please comment. I'll try to reply. Thank you for chatting live when this video was viewed. Thank you for chatting with me live. God bless you, and may God keep you, and may heaven continue to smile upon you and give you its peace. God bless.